you ever been confused about the words freehold and leasehold? They're very common terms with regards to property in the UK, and it's something that we felt needed clarifying for those of you that don't understand the difference. To clarify what the two words mean, freehold is where you own a property and you also own the land that that property sits on. So you have ultimate rights across both the property and the land that it sits on. The difference between that and leasehold is that with leasehold, generally speaking, you own the property, but you don't own the land that it sits on. This is a very historical thing in the country and goes back hundreds of years to when land was divided up between the aristocracy, but still it is relevant today as a lot of properties are still leasehold. There are certain areas of the country, central London, various pockets around the country that are still leasehold to this day. In recent years, it's become common for new build housing developers to buy a piece of land, build a load of houses and sell the properties as leasehold. They did this purely for profit reasons. They were able to sell the property, a detached house, for $500,000, but they were able to retain ownership of the land. They were then able to charge the homeowner a rent per year to be able to live there. These rents increased considerably in many cases, and the government brought in legislation to curb it and then eventually outlawed it. So new build developers are now not allowed to sell houses, leasehold. They're only allowed to sell them freehold. The majority of leasehold situations now are historical. In some areas, such as places like central London, they will always be leasehold because they are historically owned, normally by aristocracy, dukes, earls, the king. The Duchy of Westminster owns an awful lot of land, and they will pay a ground rent in perpetuity. The difference between that and new build housing developers was that they were really taking the mick out of many people who'd purchased homes, and they were paying astronomical prices. The next thing to consider is service charges. So the two are different. So ground rent and service charges are quite often two separate things. Ground rent was just a rent to be able to own the property on the land that it sat. Service charges went towards things like the maintenance of communal areas, parks, grass, roadways, lighting. And in many new build developments, there is still a service charge to pay. Even though you own the freehold for the land in which your house is situated, there is quite often still a service charge, and in many cases quite rightly so, because the council haven't adopted the services they need to be paid for and maintained. Another element to consider is flats and apartments. So generally speaking, most flats and apartments are leasehold. And that is because they are obviously in a block, and you can't own the land on which your apartment sits because you've got several other apartments below you. So there will be leasehold situations in apartments, which is very common, and then there will be a management company normally set up to manage the block of apartments. Sometimes it's managed by the owners, sometimes it's managed by an external company. There's pros and cons for both, but normally apartments will be leasehold. It's important to look at that if you're buying a property. Consider if it's freehold or leasehold. Some of the new build properties that were built when developers were allowed to sell them as leasehold are still leasehold, and you need to consider that when you're purchasing a property. It might affect your mortgage, it might affect your ability to resell the property in the future. In many cases, you are able to buy the freehold. You wouldn't be able to buy the freehold in one of these historical setups that we've discussed, such as in central London, but on a new build housing estate that was maybe built 10 years ago and sold as leasehold, you can normally buy the freehold, typically £5,000, £6,000, £7,000, £8,000, that kind of money. In our experience, most people will always do that. It's a relatively small amount of money versus the value of the house, and then to be able to sell it in the future as freehold is way better than selling it as leasehold. Even though in many cases the leasehold doesn't really materially affect the day-to-day, it's just a stigma, and people don't like feeling that they are beholden to a management company or a freeholder. In many cases with a leasehold house, there are certain stipulations that have to be met. A good example of that is if you want to extend the property, if it's a leasehold property, quite often you have to get permission from the freeholder to be able to do any work, which, just doesn't feel very nice when you own a property, and it can delay things. And in many cases, if people were looking at a freehold house versus a leasehold house, they're going to go with the freehold house over the leasehold. Many of the leases are very, very long. So we deal with properties where the leases are 999 years, or the residue of 999 years. So, obviously they're going to last a lot longer than we are. And in some cases, the leaseholds are a lot shorter. We have a property locally that we're handling currently, where the owner really has been unable to sell it because the length of the lease currently is only about 80 years. And obviously that would put most buyers off. It also would be a major problem for most lenders as well. So that client is currently trying to buy the freehold off the freeholder to be able to then sell the property. So all these things need considering, but the basic premise is that if a property is freehold, you own the land. If it's leasehold, you don't. So make sure that you check that out and ask any questions of us anytime. Please make sure that you subscribe to our channel and click the bell notification icon below. Bye.